very much. Okay, this one. Okay, is that good like that? Yeah, okay, great. Hi there, everyone. My name is Bob Trafford. I'm a journalist by training, and for the last 2 years I've worked for an organization called Forensic Architecture. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. But I'm very pleased that I've followed Paula here, because I think there are some really interesting currents that I can continue. I'm going to be taking you from big data back down to small data, in some cases very small. But I think there's some real continuation in this idea that there is an awful lot of information out there, there is a lot of data out there, and what a lot of us are lacking at the moment are the tools to properly interpret that data. And I'm going to apply that idea to very small data sets. So Forensic Architecture is a human rights investigations agency. We're based at the University of London. We produce evidence for national and international legal forums, including the ICC, and for civil society processes such as citizens' tribunals, truth commissions, and indeed certain, in the past, UN conventions. We're commissioned by legal teams, human rights groups, NGOs, activists, communities, practically any part of civil society. The only people we won't work for are states and militaries. We use very innovative techniques in both the production of our evidence and the presentation of our evidence. Some of those techniques I'll take you on a whistle-stop tour now. We use forensic image and video analysis, as in this case, assembling videos and images and camera positions in digital space. What you're seeing there is an enormous digital model. And in this case, we were investigating Israel's 2014 assault on the city of Rafah in Gaza, and we were able to support conclusions by Amnesty International that multiple specific violations of international humanitarian law had occurred during that assault. We also recreate crime scenes as physical models as well as digital models. In this case, we were investigating the 2006 murder by neo-Nazis of a young Turkish immigrant in southern Germany, and exploring the question of why a German state intelligence officer had been sat in the next room while the murder occurred and not intervened. We also rely very heavily, almost exclusively, on what is called open source information. That is information that's in the public domain, on social media, in government records, and images, including satellite imagery. And what you're seeing here is an image from our investigation into the quite famous disappearance of 43 students in Iguala in Mexico in 2014, in which multiple state agencies were heavily implicated. This is, in fact, a visualization of thousands of pages of publicly available information, data mined and visualized within an interactive web platform, which is, of course, based around a satellite image of the town of Iguala. So we focus on instances of state violence against civilians or in conflict, usually where the involvement of a state in the act of violence precludes that state from adequately investigating or prosecuting the perpetrators, often because those perpetrators are themselves state agents. And one of the central problems of conducting investigations into state violence is that the state controls the rules of evidence and courtroom procedure. And this requires us to operate across a number of different forums. What you're seeing here is our work exhibited at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. We find artistic spaces and cultural institutions are a very valuable way for us to navigate around the strictures of legal procedures, particularly when state bodies are the defendants. So we're required to exist in a space between journalism, human rights advocacy, forensics, the law, art, and aesthetics. And undoubtedly the growth of FA, excuse me, using the shorthand already, forensic architecture, if I slip into that, you know what I mean, I'm not talking about the Football Association. Undoubtedly our growth has been assisted and accelerated by the presence of a set of conditions that makes our work particularly necessary. And I want to talk a little bit about what those conditions are. We've developed and grown in response to a number of phenomena. The first is the urbanization of conflict. And as here in Syria, more so than anywhere else, but across the world, cities have become battlefields, and the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure has become routine in a way that I think it's fair to say is unprecedented, with some qualifications. The second is the ubiquity of smartphones and digital recording, which ensures that battlefields and sites and acts of violence have never been more thoroughly documented. We have citizen journalists everywhere in conflict zones now. We have soldiers and spies using social media, and often very badly. We have freely available satellite imagery. So the evidence of violence is really everywhere when an institution develops the ability to see it. And as I said at the top, I think what I mean in this case, in respect of our work, is that the evidence of violence can be there in very small data sets, in individual images, in where people are posting material from. And I just wanted to highlight that contrast, perhaps, to Paula's work on finding valuable information in big data sets. Now, the response of many states to this sort of panoptic documentation of violence has been to encourage something that our director likes to call the insurgency against truth. And what has become common currency now for the new cohort of autocrats that we're seeing across the world is a tendency, which again is enabled by a certain set of political and social circumstances, including actually, perversely, the availability of an enormous amount of visual information, an enormous amount of images, without the accompanying mainstreaming of image literacy in society. There's an awful lot of image and video material out there, and quite a lot of the time we're not sure what we're looking at. And those circumstances, that particular circumstance and others, have enabled autocratic regimes, states and militaries to attack not only the truth of a particular incident, did a chemical attack occur here or not, but the very possibility of establishing truth, whether there is even truth out there to be found. And in telling you a little bit about our efforts and our ways of working, I want to give you an overview of what some of those modern ways of establishing those truths can be. Now, this dual violence, which is committed by states, which is both against people and then subsequently against facts and against truth and against evidence, demands a number of things from civil society. Not only that a technical forensic capacity should exist outside of state authority, but that we should begin to understand truth and verification both as a commons, as a kind of resource that society needs to function healthily, like air or water, but also as a practice. Truth should be considered a practice, not a monolithic, objective absolute that exists elsewhere and needs to be accessed or proven or denied, confirmed or otherwise. Truth has to be something that civil society at all levels does together. This is something our director calls network-based verification. And it's a means of arriving at the truth that is cross-referenced, that is mutually supporting, and that explicitly involves community making, partnership with and among communities affected by state violence and activists and their supporters on the ground. And in the context of today's presentation, what we've heard from Julie's framing, this is exactly social cohesion. This is truth building as a kind of glue, as a social glue. So in the brief time that I have left to speak to you, I want to share with you a few examples of the practical possibilities created for civil society, rather, by the prevalence of images and videos, as well as the strength of community making when it comes to evidence and some of the possible ways forward for human rights reporting and advocacy. I want to start here in Syria. This is the Damascus suburb of Douma, because it's in the aftermath of the kinds of chemical weapons attacks that occurred earlier this year here in April 2018, that this kind of insurgency against truth is commonly deployed. It becomes very visible. So here, transparent against a digital model of the scene of the attack, is the image of a Russian TV journalist reporting with their usual glee on the potential holes and questions that they found in the crime scene of this alleged chemical weapons attack. Following the surrender of the rebels in Douma very shortly after this attack, Russian journalists were the first to be allowed to the scene by the Syrian regime. There's no surprise there. And they reported with dutiful skepticism on the suggestion that this canister had ever contained chlorine gas. This is despite a wealth of visual information, videos, and image material that arrived on social media showing people suffering the symptoms of exactly that. But why I wanted to start with this case is because it's exactly this video material captured by these journalists endeavoring to show that an attack had not happened that gave us the means to undercut their claim that the attack was staged. You'll see here, highlighted in blue, oh excuse me, I've jumped ahead, highlighted in blue at the back here is a sort of twisted metal object that we've highlighted in our model. You'll see it again here at the bottom of the frame. Now, if I skip forward again, you'll see that we've recomposed that object using architectural modeling techniques. And you might begin to get a picture of what it is now. This twisted metal blue object that is sat behind this Russian journalist as he's reporting on the fact that this canister has been carried here by rebels to make it look as if the Syrian regime is attacking its own civilians with chemical weapons, is in fact the delivery mechanism that the Syrian regime have used to do so. Here it is again. This is a flight harness. This is used to deliver chlorine gas canisters to the ground. So this is just one example, and within the frame of that, the image of the Russian journalist, there were 3 or 4 more examples of very specific pieces of visual, physical evidence that in fact showed that the things that they were recording themselves saying in the same frame of the video were not true and could not be true. Okay, I'm going to go on now to show you a short video of an investigation that we did in Cameroon on behalf of Amnesty International. I want to discuss this investigation as an example of what can occur when traditional on-the-ground human rights reporting and research and advocacy and interviewing is married to the kind of technical capacity that forensic architecture can offer, but also to more simple open source intelligence techniques. And I should say that whenever I'm showing sort of complicated architectural modeling techniques on screen, I am to some degree aping the work of other people in my office. I'm not an architect and I can't do digital modeling. I'm an open source investigative journalist and a researcher. So I want to show you this project because this is more onto my home turf. This is what can happen when the on-the-ground work that field researchers do is married to the information that's already available online and the results that that can achieve. So to set the scene quickly, we were asked by Amnesty International to investigate allegations of torture and extrajudicial killing at a military base in the north of Cameroon. The sort of conflict context is the Cameroonian security forces ongoing skirmishes with Boko Haram along the Cameroonian-Nigerian border in around 2016, we're talking here. Now, in the course of this investigation, we uncovered something that testimony had only hinted at, and we uncovered this through open source research, and it allowed us to leverage a great deal of allowed us a great deal of leverage against the Cameroonian security forces, and we hope began to wrap up this program of the torture and killing of civilians that was apparently carrying on with impunity at this particular base until this time. Okay, I think we can roll the video, please.
At the heart of the international coalition fighting Boko Haram is Cameroon's elite Rapid Intervention Battalion, known as the BIR. Amnesty International has documented more than 100 cases of torture committed by Cameroon's security forces since 2013. At Salak, illegal detention and torture take place with the likely knowledge of the BIR's senior command, including in places that are accessible and could be visible to US and other foreign personnel. Detainees saw foreign personnel from their cells.
We will see them and they will see us. We look at the cells from where they are. I saw white men in Salak many times. Everyone said they were Americans and we knew American soldiers stocked material in Salak. I saw them jogging from the back window of my cell, as well as standing in front of our cell, just where the garage was.
Tendering documents from December 2013 support witness testimonies describing a US presence in Salak. Until now, the US presence at Salak has gone unreported. Photographs posted onto social media by US personnel confirm their presence throughout Salak. Here, US personnel are seen training Beer soldiers. In this clip, US and Beer personnel are seen playing football with night vision equipment. We cross-referenced the reported locations of US soldiers, the locations of US personnel's social media photographs, the places where detainees are held, and those places where detainees are tortured.
So we're going to return to that map. Oops, Amnesty's got a bit of free advertising there. Move on from that. We're going to return to that map at the end of the video shortly, but I just want to talk about a little bit about how we got there. So what you have at the top here are some hand-drawn images drawn by people who experienced torture and violence and detention in Salak. And here we have some aerial images of the site. One is a sort of a zoom in of the other. So one of our first steps was to try and make these two maps fit together. And you can see broadly you have a sort of a row of 4 buildings across the top here, which correspond to these on the left-hand side. And from there, we begin to fit information that witnesses have told us and that comes from testimony with what we can see from publicly available information. And then we went further and we said, well, what do we find if we start to type things like Salak into Google? And I'm not going to say it was exactly that simple, but it was. This stuff doesn't have to be hard. Well, when you start typing names of Cameroonian military bases into Google, you might begin to find things like contracts which tie US special forces to that base, which indeed we did. And by using very simple Facebook searching tools, I was able to find photos taken by a US military contractor. He'd been posted out to this base to fly drones for the US Special Forces. He obviously wanted to send some photos to his family at home, and he hadn't either used his Facebook privacy settings or turned his geolocation off. So this one was kind of a free hit because it sort of walked right up to us. And what do we begin to find? Well, we begin to be able to piece together the testimony that we've been given, that people said they saw white people in Salak, that there was a building called the Emergence building. We begin to be able to piece that together with what we see here. At the bottom, you'll see a labeled map that we sent back digitally to former detainees of Salak, now in the Cameroonian judicial system. And we numbered this, and we marked it up for them, and we said, can you tell us specifically what these buildings were and what they were used for? So not only are we using open source information to push the investigation in new ways, which ultimately lead to the kind of leverage which I mentioned, but we're also feeding open source information back into the traditional human rights witnessing, interviewing, advocacy process to push the results further in a different way. Do I have more slides related to that? Yes, okay, so here we are. So the end result of this investigation was this map. And I talked about both the production and the presentation of our evidence. We're coming on to the presentation now. What we were able to do, looking at this map, was to say, well, if red is sites of torture and blue is where the Americans were, then the very least we can say is that American personnel, that rather, let's do it the other way around, that torture occurred in areas that are visible to and accessible to US personnel. And in this case, open source information opened up a brand new avenue for us. We were able to take these allegations to the US State Department, to the Pentagon. We published articles in the US news website, The Intercept. And the results were quite astonishing. I mean, you know, we're a small organization, and for civil society to counterpunch against state violence is very difficult, and the results are limited and few. In this case, the US military, the Pentagon, launched an internal inquiry into whether their soldiers had known about this. I mean, they're special forces, so you'd expect them to be fairly bright sparks, fairly aware. And they're also, as we know, training the very same soldiers who are alleged to have conducted this torture. What else did it lead to? Also, the cessation of military aid from the US to Cameroon pending the outcome of these inquiries. So I wanted to present this investigation to you because what it shows is that when we combine what we might consider fairly traditional field research, going and speaking to people who've suffered violence at the hands of states, going and engaging with communities. Okay, well, that nicely bookends the Cameroon chapter, that's great. Okay, so next I'd like to show you a clip from an investigation into the US bombing of a mosque in Idlib, Syria, in which at least 40 civilians were killed. I'm aware that I've gone over my 20 minutes, so I'm going to make this my final example. There is some more material that I might be able to show to you individually. I'll preface the scene while the projector loads up. Is someone turning the projector on? Thanks. Okay, so the year is 2017. We're in Idlib province in Syria. The US says it's conducted a successful airstrike against an Al-Qaeda meeting house. They say it's been hit. They say scores of senior Al-Qaeda leaders have been killed. Whenever they say things like scores of leaders, you know that they're obviously over-egging the pudding, to use an English phrase. And they said care has been taken to avoid hitting the nearby mosque. So I'm going to show you, it's about a 2.5 minute video, if we can keep the lights on that long. And again, what I want you to take note of here is not only where we've used open source information to support our on-the-ground investigation, but in this case particularly, take note of the amount of individuals and institutions that contribute to to what in this case was a network of verification, a community practice of truth building. You're going to see experts based in London, based in America. You're going to see photographers and community leaders on the ground. You're going to see architects on the ground. You're going to see members of the local religious community. And all of these groups, near and far, shall we say, activist, community, and sort of distant sort of technical capacity, are going to come together to create a kind of community of practice around truth and around verification. And what you'll see is that when we do that, while it takes some effort to establish that kind of network, what you'll see is that the top-down proclamations of states in relation to state violence and in relation to grievous human rights crimes that they've committed don't stand up for a second. Okay, I suppose I should fluff for another minute more.
And it's changing as a result of technological progress, for example, and what does that mean for issues of quality and fairness and justice and inequality? So if you look at these two presentations, I mean, one of the things that we see with Paula is how do we leverage technology to see the things that we currently are not seeing, right? So when we kick off to the next part of the presentation after Bob, one of the things that we will be looking at is how can you take that principle and apply to your work, right? So take radio, right? Easy, low tech. There's so much noise there, but how do you make sense of it? How do you leverage technology to pick up patterns that you can use in your work, right? What Bob is talking to us about is really leveraging the power playing field. In many of these cases, the state has the monopoly over the information, and as such, over power. How do you leverage evidence and information from no matter where it comes from, right? So you have a mix of sectors that don't really come together. Forensics, architecture, human rights, journalism. Think about your projects. How many non-intuitive sectors do you have coming around to be able to expose more of the truth, right? So when you think back to the projects that you are working on, to what extent some of these principles you can apply in your own work, and you've got people online, we've picked the best of the best to be here, that we can then help you work with in the aftermath, right? So these are the two things. One, how do we augment what we see, work of Paula, and then how do we tilt the power balance and expose the truth to the bigger demographics and groups in the population? Just wanted to add
a pretty good summary. Thank you. Yeah, I mean the power balance is an interesting point. You know that these new technologies and social media are breaking monopolies on information. I think that's important to note. And at the moment, we have a bewildering amount of information in the world and a really tragic lack of literacy. And what I want you to think about is building image literacy. And I hope the examples that I'm giving here show a little bit of what you can do when you begin to read images and begin to understand what's in an image, and also what you can do when you begin to work with on-the-ground community networks and begin to think of opposing state power, opposing monopolies of power and information through this kind of network-based truth practice. So I think we're ready to, yeah, can we have the second video there, please?
Our investigation seeks to establish what was the use of the building, were there civilian casualties, and how did the incident unfold in space and time. Using available and sourced imagery, videos, satellite photographs, and survivor testimonies, we began analyzing the building before and after the strike. We have identified 2 large craters in the north part of the building. Munitions experts confirmed they are consistent with 2 500-pound bombs. We obtained a video of the building recorded 2 months prior to its destruction. On the roof is the Adhan speaker, used for the call to prayer. A sign next to the entrance reads, Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab Mosque. We asked a local photographer to document the interior after the strike. The mosque's entrance sign is still by the door. Shelves for worshippers' shoes indicate it is a mosque. As do the rugs in the mihrab, where the imam leads the prayer, which clearly indicate that contrary to US statements, the building is a large and functioning mosque. We interviewed and exchanged architectural plans with the building's original contractor and caretaker, who was also wounded in the strike. The upper floor, he said, contained the imam's flat. His wife was at home and was killed in the strike. The ground floor contained the main prayer hall in the south, as well as the ritual washing room, the toilets, the kitchen, and the winter prayer hall in the north part.
Okay, so that's just a short clip from an investigation which ultimately led to various retractions and apologies from the US military and actually condemnation from the UN. So well done, you guys. And I think what you can see there is that we've managed to bring together a wealth of people on the ground to confront what would otherwise have been an accepted truth in a 3-line press release. And when you see that, I mean, I don't know if it does you, but it really makes me think about any time I've heard that there's been a strike over Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan in the last 15 years. You know, these press releases are 2 lines long, and what they contain appears so absolute and so uniformly true. And the opportunities are out there to embarrass the people that make those press releases and to show them up, essentially. So I'm going to skip over my next example, and I'm just going to get to. It doesn't feel like a PowerPoint presentation unless you have some words flashing up on the screen. So forensic architecture's approach, as I want to encapsulate it for you, is to build communities of practice. Multiple voices in coalition against state power are invariably more effective than voices speaking on their own. Independently, we have no right to speak for communities in Syria where we work, but together with them and together with their supporters on the ground, we feel like we do. Make use of open sources. I'm not going to give you lists of tools now, but I can certainly show you some of the things that we would commonly use on my laptop. The open source investigation community is enormous. It's growing every day. It's encouraging and friendly. To my mind, it's one of the only good and interesting parts of Twitter. And it really does empower you in very simple ways. 2 hours learning basic open source techniques, and you will be so much more able to engage with the image material that exists out there, which at the moment is confounding a great deal of us. On-the-ground experience supported by technical capacity. That's exactly what I've shown you with the bombing of the Al-Jina Mosque. Yeah, as I said, understand what's in an image, become image literate. We see so many things every day and we miss 98% of what's valuable in them. Did I have more to say? Something about, yes, okay, so these simple open source tools, just to really hammer home the point, they can help you to observe and understand environmental and urban change. I've had to leave out my example about environmental violence monitoring through satellite imagery, but the wealth of satellite imagery that's available is really quite staggering, and there are tools to interpret it which are free, which can, again, allow you to affect real social and political change. And we are examples of doing so. You can find evidence that's hidden in plain sight, as I've already said. We can support the work of on-the-ground field researchers. And ultimately, what it's all about, we can hold state authorities and corporations to account. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to talking through some of this with you.
Thanks ever so much. That was fantastic. We do want to get into the discussions at the tables, but before we do that, maybe 5-10 minutes if there are any specific questions that come out of Bob's presentation and or from Paula's earlier on. So we've got 3 over here. Take the lady in green first, because you're closest to her, and then we'll come over here.
Maybe this is a bit more to Paula's presentation on big data. We saw in the US in 2016 how people who want to create new narratives will infiltrate social media and other sources of big data. How can we in our programming ensure that we are not doing harm? So that our analysis of the big data is not the narrative that some groups want us to promote. Thank you.
And then this gentleman here, please.
Great, thanks. Martin Gromatic of Hidalgo-Sanchis Justice. I have a question to Bob. It's absolutely fascinating, but you're 20 people right? And you have limited capacity, and there are so many injustices in this world. My question is, what is the scalability of your approach? Can we imagine someday people in Syria and Cameroon doing this thing on themselves?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this fascinating glimpse into your work. And my question is actually related to humans, because what comes out of your presentation is that no matter how far we've advanced with using technology for some of the work that we're doing, we still need human power or human sources, sometimes to supply additional information, to verify the information that we get from other resources. So my question is, how do we protect those that provide that for us from potential retaliation, based on the premise that those that run information monopolies do not like to be exposed and embarrassed?
Thanks so much. We'll start with you, Paula.
Yeah, thanks. So on the question of the content on social media, big data, social media data, public data is like any other type of data. In order to analyze, first you need to understand it. So who's posting the data? What are the biases of this data? So once you identify that, you can understand how is it useful and what type of method to do. So what I was saying, in the context of Somalia, with the experimental work we did over 1 year, we realized what is useful is not to understand the content and to look for trends over time, volume over time, but more interesting is to look at fake groups and what are they posting, the fake groups, so related to what you say, and yeah, different things in who is posting, what are the influences, but depends on how people use it. So in any different context, in any different time, people might change the way they are using the social media. So first you understand the data, and we spend quite some time doing that, doing the landscape of the media use in the country, and understanding again and again the biases of the data to then design. So it's not about you analyze the content, but first you understand how is the social media platform used in that country, in that time frame, and then see what's useful for you. Maybe in your case, what is useful is to identify who's posting, when, and why these fake events, these fake news, etc.
Thanks so much. And then two questions for you, Bob. One about the scale that this could achieve and related to that localization, and then a second question about the security and the vulnerability of people who might be involved in this sort of work with you.
Sure, thank you. Both very good questions. I mean, in terms of the scalability, you know, we're a research organisation. We're part of the University of London. We're mandated to go out and explain our techniques and share our techniques, and not only the techniques, but the principles behind them. And undoubtedly, some of the techniques that you've seen there in terms of architectural modelling are specific, and they require years of training. But a great many of them don't, and a great many of the principles that underlie the work that we're doing are about literacy, are about a sort of investigative sentiment, are about research capacity, and these are things which, to my mind, there is no barrier in terms of scalability. You know, these are essentially educational goals more than anything else. And I think practically you can see some of the skills that and some of the techniques that certainly we didn't invent them, we didn't develop them originally, but we've been part of a kind of open source research community for a decade now, and we have seen the skills and the skill sharing that began there grow and expand enormously into the BBC, the New York Times. The work of Bellingcat has been incredible in exposing Russian officers throughout Europe. And also in civil society elsewhere, you know, in Amnesty and Greenpeace have their own open source investigators now. There's no reason that this can't scale, I think. Yeah, and as it comes to the question of protection of human sources, again, it's a very good question, and it's one that we grapple with in almost every case, and certainly, you know, there are cases about which it makes more sense not to disclose our sources, not to discuss them, and anyone who's been mentioned here has, after extensive deliberation themselves and with us, felt comfortable to go on the record insofar as they have, which isn't to say name and address. But I think also a really important part of what it means to be protected as a source is to know that you are not the only source of information. You're right, of course, that state powers and state monopolies don't like people to break them, but also there are certain practical rules by which those kind of monopolies and power structures operate. And if removing one person from the equation, shall we say, doesn't stop that information being in the public domain, then there is no value to doing that. And so part of this network-based verification, part of this practice of community building when it comes to truth is about protection and is about saying that this information comes from multiple voices at once, and silencing one voice makes no difference. But that said, we're very aware of our quite privileged position in our university offices in London, and we do work with people in very exposed situations, and you're right to call us on that.